The first time in my life I was aware of the concept of fascism when I was about 5 years old, and anybody who is my age, I'm 61 now, will remember a series called All Our Yesterdays, which was like World at War, only very, very boring. The only non-boring episode, to be honest, was the one that I inadvertently saw the first 10 seconds of, which is the one about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which was a concentration camp liberated by the British in 1945. My mum just leapt up, which is unusual. We were a very sedentary family. My mother leapt up and just said, "We're not watching this," switched it off. She was half Jewish and had spent the war the war began when she was 5 years old. She knew, because her relatives told her, that if we lost the war, she would be dead. And what was interesting is that attitude, which would seem very alien to many of you, that attitude of people who had lived through the war and knew about what we now call the Holocaust, but did not call it then, they didn't want to talk about it. Even if they hadn't been primarily affected. She wasn't in that sense a survivor, but they didn't want to talk about what had happened. This was also true of ex-service people. My uncle got sunk in the Royal Navy in the Atlantic and survived and never talked about it. There's a word, we never talk about it. You'll hear that a lot in post-war society. But at the root, the kind of, as well as trauma, as well as just wanting to get on with things, there was a logic to not talking about what had happened. And it was this: it can never happen again. It was a one-off. It was something to do with the German character. We don't know what, but it's been cured by, bombing their cities to smithereens and rolling tanks over their country and reorganizing it. And yes, it was something to do with psychology, but there don't seem to be any Hitler-type people around anymore. So what's the problem? Around about that time, a historian called Ernst Nolte, German conservative, became the first serious writer to attempt a history of three fascisms, a comparative history. So Nazism, Mussolini's fascism, and the fascism of a failed right-wing group called Action Française, which was monarchic and anti-Semitic, which failed in the sense that it only succeeded when Hitler invaded France, and some of them became, collaborator government type people. But it failed as a movement. So Nolte writes, "Fascism in its era." Its title in English is "The Three Faces of Fascism." But the title gives away the assumption. There was a fascist era, and it is over, and it can never happen again. We've seen all possible variants of it, and so good, now we can study it, because that's the ideal position, to be studying something when it's a finished fact. That was the assumption of my mother, of the people I grew up around. That was the assumption of the world I grew up in. But round about the same time as Nolte was writing his book, French fascist Maurice Bardèche spent his life denying the Holocaust and had been a Nazi collaborator. Bardèche wrote this: "With another name, another face, and with nothing which betrays the projection from the past, with the form of a child we do not recognize, and the head of a young Medusa, the Order of Sparta will be reborn." The Order of Sparta is Nazi speak for Nazism. Now, unfortunately, he was right. We are living through the rebirth of a new fascism. And what I've tried to do in the book is to explain what it is, where it's coming from, how it thinks, how the people who support it think, and how we might defeat it. People say to me when I kind of try and, get them to review this book, newspaper editors, "What's the problem, Paul? When Trump's gone, sure, Tommy Robinson once had 1 million Facebook followers, and Cadbury's Cream Egg only had 2 million. But he's been kicked off Facebook. So what's the problem? The problem isn't that there are 5 or 6 far-right groups in Britain who get about 100 in the Batley by-election, stood against each other. They all got 100, patriotic alternative for Britain. That's not the problem. A bigger problem is that 1 in 6, nearly 1 in 5, terror convicts in British jails are Nazis. It is no longer the exclusive preserve of Irish republicanism and then Islamic extremism. It is now the far right is catching up. The reason why we don't hear a lot about it is because they rarely perpetrate. One guy, we don't know yet, but the police have not closed the book about the Plymouth mass shooter as to whether or not he was an organised far right member, but the ideologies which we'll talk about was clearly far right. So that's an annoyance. Another thing that's an annoyance is if you're in my profession. I was filming on Whitehall in mid-2019 and was surrounded by Tommy Robinson supporters. How did I know they were Tommy Robinson supporters? They were singing, "Oh, Tommy, 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 Tommy Robinson," into my face. And as I filmed them, I realised for the first time in my life, they weren't just shouting about something abstract. They were shouting, "Paul Mason, Marxist, traitor to your country, we've researched you." So that's also a bit of a problem. But no, none of these things are earth-shattering. I wouldn't get out of bed and write a book about these things if I was just worried about that. What I'm worried about is that a second fascist era is possible. And as Bardesh suggested, the fascism that we are seeing has been regrown from its original philosophical roots, which those of you who know about it and about philosophy may know that we're actually in the pre-1914 period, in the period of Nietzsche, Bergson, scientific racism, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the scientific racist, and Oswald Spengler, the famous author of the famous book, bestseller, The Decline of the West. It is in that philosophical ethos, and from that philosophical ethos, that has emerged a philosophical fascism. And why is this important? Because the metaphor I use is that it's regrown from its roots, but in a different greenhouse, if you see what I mean. In the greenhouse of now, in the greenhouse of networked society, of feminism, which we'll come to, and climate change, and globalization. And so it can survive in a way that the fascism that I fought as an activist in the 1970s, 80s and early 90s, in the Anti-Nazi League, then in a group called Anti-Fascist Action, that fascism of the National Front, Combat 18, British National Party, was, in a way, it was the old plant. Or to switch metaphors, it was like a tribute band to Nazism. That's why it wasn't very popular. Behind the scenes, we all knew that the leaders of the BNP had, posed with swastikas in private, even if in public they flew the Union Jack. The other thing is, and sometimes as an activist, as a white bloke with a working class accent, one was designated as being the person who would go and stand in their bit of Brick Lane and not in our bit. So I stood next to them and listened to them. I have to say, obnoxious though they were, those fascists were rational people. They had a rational, if wrong, hatred of all the change going on around them. Their dads and granddads had drank in the same pubs. They'd been Mosleyites in the 30s, their grandparents. The pubs and boxing clubs of the East End of London. That's where they came from. And I couldn't see their point, but I could recognise a kind of motivation. Today's fascism is very different because in its regrowth, it has regrown around one form of behaviour that you will see time and again, from the Capitol Hill insurrection, from Bolsonaro's mass support in Brazil, right the way through to the extreme parts of the anti-vax movement here, which is what I call performative self-deception. These are people who no longer believe science, their own eyes and ears. Hannah Arendt said this, and I quoted in the book. Hannah Arendt, writing about Nazism, said, as they create their lying world, they have to create a logic that follows where everything, they only believe, she says, their imagination and not their eyes and ears, because their imagination can summon up something consistent, whereas their eyes and ears provide contradictory things they can't get their heads around. And it is that new fascism that I want to just spend a little bit of time anatomizing. In the book, there's a whole chapter of case studies about the way that modern fascism uses symbolic violence to tell a story. What they're doing when they're going on a mass shooting spree, as in the Christchurch, New Zealand mass shooting at 2 mosques, or when they simply stage demonstrations in favour of the right, armed demonstrations in favour of the right to catch COVID, as they've been doing all across America. They're trying to tell a story, and what I want to try and leave you with more than anything else, apart from the last bit, which is what we do, is an understanding of what that story is.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.